So looking at your task 3, it's a report. And we'll go through how you structure a report a little bit in a moment. But at the moment, I just want to read through and tell you what it is that you need to do. It says it's a vocational scenario. Your department has been very successful, and so the local authority is looking to gain best practice advice. For this, you've been put in charge of writing a report to explain the factors that influence communication and interaction. Furthermore, you will need to explain how the communication barriers in communication can be overcome with view to explaining how to access the additional support or services that allow people to communicate effectively. So it's been broken down into two parts. As you can see, there's a B1, which is 2.3 and 2.4, and a B2, 2.6, and then your B3 is your references. So if we go and guide you through looking at specifically what the B areas are about. So it says, firstly, you will need to explain the factors that influence communication and interaction. Your answers need to be concentrated on at least one of each of the barriers. Secondly, you will need to explain how each barrier to communication can be overcome. For this, you will need to explain how to communicate to meet the needs of others and consider things like the factors which influence communication and interaction between others and the barriers to effective communication and how these can be overcome. Now, looking at the factors, factors can include things like language, dialect, jargon, terminology, acronyms, environmental, attitudes, anxieties, confidence, power balance, types of relationships, sensory ability, health, medical conditions, learning disabilities, age ranges, alcohol or drugs, and professional priorities. On the other hand, the barriers are things like the sensory aspect, so your senses like your sight and your hearing, cognitive aspects like dementia and disability, language skills such as first language, aphasia, and so on, environment such as high noise or privacy, social aspects such as cultural or interpersonal, and the proximity, as in how close somebody is to somebody else. Now, the way I've done the support sheet is to look at what it says. So for example, it's going to be a report, and the first part is asking you to explain how barriers to communication can be overcome. So you need to think about one sensory, one cognitive, one language, one environmental, one social barrier, and how they can be overcome. So consider naming and describing what it is, how it's a problem. So if you've got a sensory barrier such as hearing impairment, how is that a barrier to communication? And then how can you overcome it, for example? The second part is looking at explaining factors. So here you want one description in relation to each barrier and one example of how the factor influences communication. So, for example, if you think about the barrier, such as sensory, and you've got hearing, could any of these factors be related to sensory? So, for example, if we think about hearing, you can consider that if somebody has a sensory barrier such as hearing, they might not be able to hear as well if the environment is also poor. So if there is something to do with the environment where it's noisy or it's very highly distracting to somebody with a hearing impairment, for example, or maybe if the language is complicated and so it has an effect on the barrier of hearing, or maybe it is to do with the dialect. If somebody's speaking with an accent, it can be difficult for somebody who is hard of hearing to be able to make sense of things, because that's another barrier, that's another factor that has a problem. So what you want to do is you want to pick out, because you need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so one of each of here. When you're looking at describing what is this as a barrier to communication and you're trying to explain it, you can at the same time, because you're thinking how to overcome them, you can at the same time consider how any of those would be linked to something over here. So you've got one description in relation to the barrier stated. So if you're looking at social barrier, such as interpersonal interactions, you might think about things like alcohol and drugs would have a part to play in that, because people do behave differently if they are undertaking drugs. They might not be as interactive if they're on some antipsychotic drugs, for example, or they might be over interactive if they're, for example, taking a hallucinogenic drug, which is making them sort of hallucinate and become too free with themselves and so on. So that's where those two come in. So you can tie them together rather than think, oh, what do I do? Let's go back to the next part. So remember, it's saying explain the factors that influence and at least one of each of the barriers. So that's why we're starting off with the barriers first. So if you pick one from everywhere, and then you relate a factor to the barrier, that way you can cover both at the same time. The part to do with B2 2.6 is you need to explain how to access additional support or services for individuals you mentioned to communicate effectively. Your explanation must show knowledge and understanding of a range of additional support needs and how to access additional support services and support services that can offer to enable individuals to communicate effectively. When you've got those, things that you are looking at is considering things like speech and language therapists, translation therapy or interpretation services, advocacy services, specialist equipment, support from others, for example. Now, if we take a look at how I've put it into the support sheet, the support sheet is saying, can you make sure that you do one of each? So what you can do is when you're looking at one of each, you can consider how they might be related to what you were talking about. So maybe you want one that is related to sensory, one that's related to cognitive, one that's related to language, one that's related to social, and so on. So you're finding, because you're finding the problems here in a way, the barriers, the issues that there can be with communication, you are then relating them to how you can actually help support somebody to overcome those barriers, overcome those factors that you mentioned. So with all of that, that's where you are going with that aspect, and the additional support, as you can see, are over here. So I am wishing you the best of luck with completing this. Remember, you are always trying to make sure that you're using Harvard style referencing to support your ideas. So if you're finding a speech and language therapist that you're talking about, you want to be able to reference where you found that material, how it's related, and so on.